The bruises had become a map of her marriage. Purple continents across her ribs. Blue rivers down her arms. Yellow islands fading on her cheeks. Sarah pressed her fingers against the swollen flesh beneath her left eye and winced. 3 years of this. 3 years of walking on eggshells that always cracked beneath her feet no matter how carefully she stepped. The sound of Thomas's truck rumbling up the dirt road sent ice through her veins. She grabbed the canvas bag she'd hidden under the porch 2 weeks ago. Inside were 3 apples, a water canteen, matches, and the small knife her grandmother had given her before she died. Not much for a journey into the Black Hills wilderness, but it was everything she had. The truck door slammed. Sarah ran. Pine branches whipped her face as she crashed through the forest. Behind her, Thomas's voice roared her name like thunder. She'd timed this moment for weeks, waiting until he'd been drinking at the tavern, waiting until dusk when the shadows grew long and forgiving. Her feet found the deer trail she'd memorized during her secret walks. The path led deep into territory where white settlers rarely ventured. "You get back here." Thomas's shouts grew distant. "You're nothing without me. You hear me? Nothing." Sarah ran until his voice disappeared into the whisper of wind through branches. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled. She ran until the last pale light of sunset bled from the sky and stars emerged like scattered diamonds overhead. Only then did she slow to a walk, chest heaving, tears mixing with sweat on her damaged face. The forest at night was a different world. Owls called questions she couldn't answer. Creatures rustled in the underbrush with purpose and direction she envied. She had no destination, only a way. Away from fists that fell like hammers. Away from words that cut deeper than any blade. Away from the woman she'd become in that house of horrors. Her foot caught on a root and she stumbled forward, sprawling across the ground. Pain exploded through her already aching body. For a moment she lay there, face pressed against earth that smelled of moss and decay, and wondered if she should just stay down. Let the forest take her. Let the night swallow her whole. But something made her rise. Some stubborn spark that 3 years of brutality hadn't quite extinguished. She pushed herself to her knees, then to her feet, swaying like a sapling in wind. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through the canopy. Sarah walked deeper into the wilderness, each step taking her further from everything she'd known. Her wedding ring caught the moonlight and she stopped, staring at the thin gold band. With trembling fingers, she worked it over her swollen knuckle and held it up to the light. Such a small thing to have cost her so much. She threw it into the darkness and heard it land somewhere in the carpet of pine needles. Good. Let the earth have it. Let it rust and rot and return to nothing. Hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Sarah's vision swam. Her legs moved automatically, carrying her forward even as her mind began to drift. She didn't notice when the deer trail ended. Didn't register when the ground began to slope upward into rocky terrain. Awareness narrowed to the simple rhythm of one foot, then the other, then the first again. Dawn was breaking when her strength finally gave out completely. The forest tilted sideways and Sarah fell, tumbling down an embankment she hadn't seen in the dim light. Branches tore at her clothes. Rocks scraped her skin. She hit the bottom hard and lay still, unable to move, unable to think beyond the white-hot pain radiating through her body. Above her, the sky lightened from black to gray to pale blue. Birds began their morning songs. The wilderness awakened around her broken form, indifferent to her suffering, ancient and eternal and unconcerned with the small tragedy of one woman's desperate flight from terror. Sarah's eyes fluttered closed. Darkness rose up to claim her, and she surrendered to it gratefully. The dream was water. Cool and clean, flowing over her cracked lips, washing away the dust and blood. Sarah's throat worked, swallowing reflexively, and the movement dragged her back toward consciousness. Pain greeted her like an old enemy. Every muscle screamed. Every bone ached. She tried to open her eyes but only one obeyed, the other swollen completely shut. A face hovered above her. Dark eyes filled with concern. Strong features carved by sun and wind. Long black hair bound with leather cord. For a confused moment, Sarah thought she'd died and this was an angel come to guide her onward. Then the face spoke in words she didn't understand, low and melodic, and she realized this was no angel but a man very much alive. He lifted a water skin to her lips again. This time she was conscious enough to drink properly, though half the water spilled down her chin. The stranger's hands were gentle as he supported her head, patient as she took small sips. When she'd had enough, he eased her back down onto something soft. Furs, she realized. She was lying on furs inside a shelter of some kind. The man rose and moved to the entrance, speaking to someone outside. Another male voice responded. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Men. She was alone with men in a place she didn't recognize, unable to run, barely able to move. Panic clawed at her throat. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the world spun violently. The stranger returned quickly, hands raised in a calming gesture. He spoke again in his flowing language, voice soothing despite her inability to understand the words. Then he did something unexpected. He touched his chest and said clearly, Matiska. He repeated the gesture, the name. Matiska. Sarah stared at him, mind working slowly through fog and fear. He was telling her his name. She touched her own chest, voice barely a whisper. Sarah. Sarah. He repeated it carefully, the syllables strange in his mouth. Then he smiled, and the expression transformed his stern features into something warm and reassuring. He pointed at her injured eye, her bruised arms, her torn dress, and his face darkened with understanding and anger. Not anger at her, she sensed, but at what had been done to her. Over the following hours, Sarah learned she'd collapsed near a Lakota hunting camp. Matiska, whose name meant white bear, was a chief among his people. He'd found her at dawn while checking trap lines, more dead than alive, and carried her back to his lodge. A medicine woman named Joaquin had cleaned and dressed her wounds with poultices that smelled of sage and other herbs Sarah couldn't identify. Communication happened in gestures and careful demonstrations. Matiska would point at objects and speak their Lakota names. Sarah would repeat them, stumbling over unfamiliar sounds. Water was Mni. Sky was Mapia. Fire was Pita. The lessons gave her something to focus on besides pain and fear and the haunting question of what came next. Thomas would be searching for her. The thought made her shake despite the warmth of the fire. He'd track her this far if he could, drag her back to that house, make her pay for the humiliation of her escape. She'd seen what he did when she made him angry. What would he do now that she'd made him furious? Matiska noticed her trembling. He sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, and spoke in his language for several minutes. Though Sarah understood nothing, the tone conveyed meaning. Safety. Protection. Sanctuary. He placed his hand over his heart, then gestured around the camp, then back to her. The message was clear. You are safe here. Sarah wanted desperately to believe him, but trust was a luxury she'd lost somewhere between her wedding day and the moment Thomas's fist first connected with her jaw. Still, what choice did she have? She couldn't return to that life. Death would be preferable. At least here, in this camp of strangers who spoke a language she didn't know, she was alive. Broken and battered, but breathing. Night fell and the camp settled into quiet rhythms. Children's laughter drifted from nearby lodges. Someone played a flute, the notes mournful and beautiful. Matiska sat by the fire, working on repairing a bow, occasionally glancing her way to ensure she rested. The normality of it all felt surreal. No shouting. No violence. No walking on those perpetual eggshells. Sarah closed her good eye and let exhaustion pull her under. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and fears. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she slept without terror standing guard at her bedside. Tonight she was simply a wounded creature being tended by unexpected kindness in the heart of the wilderness. Morning arrived with the smell of wood smoke and cooking meat. Sarah woke slowly, momentarily confused by the circular walls and domed ceiling of the lodge. Then memory returned in a rush. The escape. The fall. Matiska finding her. She sat up carefully, testing her body's limits. Everything still hurt, but the sharp edges of pain had dulled somewhat. The swelling around her eye had reduced enough that she could partially see through it. Joaquin, the medicine woman, entered carrying a wooden bowl. She was perhaps 60 winters old, with silver threading through her black braids and eyes that seemed to see straight through to the soul. She settled beside Sarah and offered the bowl. Inside was a thick broth with chunks of meat and roots. Sarah's stomach growled despite her nervousness. She couldn't remember her last real meal. As she ate, Joaquin examined her injuries with practiced hands, nodding with satisfaction at how the wounds were healing. She applied fresh poultices, her touch firm but gentle, humming a wordless tune while she worked. When she finished, she took Sarah's face between her weathered palms and spoke a single word with profound emphasis. Winyan. She touched Sarah's chest, repeated the word, then touched her own. Winyan. Woman. Sarah understood. Not wife. Not property. Not punching bag. Simply woman. The recognition of basic humanity in that single word brought tears streaming down her face. Joaquin pulled her into an embrace, rocking her slowly while Sarah wept for everything she'd lost and everything she'd endured. The old woman's steady heartbeat against her ear became an anchor, grounding her in this moment of unexpected compassion from a stranger who owed her nothing. When the tears finally stopped, Joaquin helped Sarah to her feet. Her legs wobbled but held. Together they stepped outside into brilliant sunshine. The camp spread before her in organized clusters of lodges. Women worked on hides stretched across frames. Men shaped arrow shafts and repaired tools. Children played a game involving a ball and much laughter. Everyone paused to look at the white woman emerging from their chief's lodge, but the glances held curiosity rather than hostility. Matiskar approached from across the camp. In daylight, Sarah could better appreciate his presence. He moved with quiet authority, the kind that came from respect rather than fear. Other men greeted him as he passed. He acknowledged them with nods, but his attention remained fixed on her. He spoke to Joaquin, gesturing toward the forest. The old woman responded, then turned to Sarah with an encouraging smile. Matiskar held out his hand, an invitation. Sarah hesitated only a moment before taking it. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. He led her slowly through the camp, matching his pace to her limping steps. They walked to a stream that sang over smooth stones. Matiskar released her hand and crouched by the water, cupping his palms to drink. Sarah knelt beside him and did the same. The water was shockingly cold and tasted of minerals and snowmelt from distant mountains. It was the best thing she'd ever drunk. Matiskar began teaching her more words. He pointed at a bird and said its name. Touched a flower and spoke softly. Indicated the direction of the four winds with accompanying vocabulary. Sarah repeated everything, hungry for this new language that might help her understand this world she'd stumbled into. As they sat by the stream, a young boy approached carrying Matiskar's bow and quiver. The chief tousled the child's hair and spoke words that made the boy beam with pride before running off. Matiskar turned to Sarah and through gestures made her understand that he had a son, about 8 years old, named Thasunka for his love of horses. Sarah touched her own belly and shook her head. No children. Matiskar's expression grew somber. He seemed to understand what she couldn't say, that Thomas had made sure there would be no babies. Another thing he'd stolen from her along with her dignity and hope. The afternoon passed in quiet companionship. Matiskar never pushed her to communicate beyond her comfort. He simply existed beside her, a solid presence that asked nothing and offered everything. Safety. Patience. Time to heal. They were gifts beyond measure. When evening approached, he led her back to camp. Women had prepared a communal meal and space was made for Sarah in the circle. She sat among them, accepting food and shy smiles, understanding nothing of the conversation flowing around her but feeling welcomed nonetheless. Included. That night, lying on the furs in Matiskar's lodge while he took watch by the fire, Sarah realized something profound. For 3 years she'd believed Thomas when he said she was worthless. That no one would want her. That she deserved what he did. But here, among people who didn't know her history or speak her language, she was simply seen as someone worth saving. Worth feeding. Worth teaching. Worth existing. The revelation cracked something open in her chest. Perhaps she wasn't broken beyond repair after all. The weeks passed like water smoothing river stones, each day wearing away more of Sarah's sharp edges of fear. Her body healed faster than her spirit, the bruises fading from purple to yellow to nothing. Joaquin's medicines worked wonders she'd never imagined possible. The old woman taught her which plants stopped pain, which encouraged healing, which brought peaceful sleep. Sarah learned by watching, by doing, by slowly expanding her Lakota vocabulary one careful word at a time. Matiskar remained a constant presence. Not hovering, not demanding, simply there. He showed her how to properly tan a hide, scraping the flesh side until her arms burned with exertion. How to identify edible roots and where they grew best. How to read the sky for coming weather. Each lesson built her competence, her confidence, her sense that she might actually survive in this world so different from everything she'd known. She learned his story in pieces, assembled from gestures and the few English words a trader had taught him years ago. His wife had died bringing their second child into the world. The baby, a daughter, had followed her mother to the spirit world within days. That had been 4 winters past. Since then, Matiskar had raised the Thasunka alone with help from his sister and Joaquin. The grief still lived in his eyes sometimes, a shadow that passed when he looked at places where his wife once stood. Sarah understood that particular shade of loss. Not death, but the mourning of who she'd been before Thomas. The girl who'd laughed easily and trusted readily and believed in happy endings. That Sarah had died slowly, beaten into silence and submission. Perhaps this new Sarah, the one learning to speak Lakota and work leather, could be something different. Something stronger. The camp accepted her gradual integration. The women taught her their songs, laughing good-naturedly when she mangled the pronunciation. The men nodded respectfully when she passed. Children grew bold enough to approach her, curious about her pale skin and light hair. Thasunka appointed himself her special teacher, proudly showing her everything from how to braid grass into rope to the best spots for finding pretty stones by the stream. But peace was a fragile thing. One morning Sarah woke to unusual activity in camp. Men checked weapons and spoke in urgent tones. Matiska's jaw was tight with tension. Through Joaquin, Sarah learned that white hunters had been spotted nearby. Trappers who paid no respect to Lakota territory. Men who brought trouble. The possibility that Thomas might be among them turned Sarah's blood to ice. She'd been so focused on healing, on learning, on becoming part of this community, that she'd almost forgotten the threat he represented. Almost convinced herself he'd given up searching. Foolish. Thomas never gave up anything he considered his property. Matiska found her standing alone outside the lodge, staring toward the forest with haunted eyes. He touched her shoulder gently and she flinched, an instinctive response she hated but couldn't control. He withdrew his hand immediately, giving her space while staying close enough to offer protection. In halting Lakota mixed with gestures, Sarah tried to explain. Bad man. Her husband. Dangerous. Would hurt her. Would hurt anyone who helped her. Understanding darkened Matiska's features. He'd suspected something of the sort from her initial condition, but hearing it confirmed brought forth a cold anger Sarah had never seen in him before. He spoke firmly, words she'd learned well over the past weeks. You are under my protection. No one will harm you. I give you my word as chief. Sarah wanted to believe him. Desperately wanted to trust that this could be permanent, that she could stay here and build a real life among these people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. But she'd seen what Thomas was capable of. The rage that lived in him like a caged animal. If he found her, he wouldn't care about Lakota warriors or chiefs or codes of honor. He'd take what he considered his and destroy anyone who stood between them. The scouts returned at midday with troubling news. 5 white men camped 3 miles east, heavily armed, asking locals if they'd seen a woman matching Sarah's description. Thomas was among them. He'd brought friends, men as mean and violent as himself, and they were methodically searching the territory. The camp council convened immediately. Sarah sat outside Matiska's lodge, heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Joaquin sat beside her, holding her hand, offering silent support. The discussion inside the council lodge grew heated. Voices rose and fell like storm wind. Some argued for sending Sarah away, unwilling to risk conflict with armed white men over one woman. Others insisted that their honor demanded they protect someone who'd sought sanctuary among them. Matiska's voice cut through the argument with absolute authority. What he said, Sarah didn't fully understand, but the tone was unmistakable. This was not a debate. This was a declaration. When he emerged from the lodge, his expression was set like stone. He came directly to Sarah and knelt before her so their eyes were level. In carefully pronounced English he'd been practicing, he spoke words that would change everything. You stay. You are Lakota now. We protect our own. The decision meant war, though neither side wanted to name it such. Matiska sent warriors to intercept Thomas and his men before they reached the camp. The message was clear and simple. The woman sought refuge here. She would not be surrendered. Leave peacefully or face consequences. Thomas's response was predictable. He came riding hard with his 4 companions, rifles ready, shouting obscenities that echoed through the forest. Sarah heard his voice from half a mile away and nearly vomited from the visceral fear it triggered. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself small and invisible the way she'd learned to survive in that house of nightmares. But Joaquin gripped her hand tightly. Winyang, the old woman said firmly. Woman. Not victim. Not property. The reminder steadied her shaking legs. Matiska stood at the camp's edge with 20 warriors behind him. They didn't raise their weapons, but the threat was implicit in their stance, their numbers, their absolute unity. When Thomas rode into view, Sarah forced herself to watch from beside the lodge, forced herself to face the monster who'd stolen 3 years of her life. He looked smaller somehow. Still dangerous, still radiating violence, but diminished against the backdrop of these men who carried their strength with quiet dignity rather than brutish aggression. His face was red with rage and alcohol. His companions looked nervous, suddenly aware they were vastly outnumbered in unfamiliar territory. Sarah. Thomas roared when he spotted her. Get over here right now. You're my wife. You belong to me. The words that once would have compelled her obedience now seemed pathetic. Empty claims from an empty man. Sarah remained motionless, Joaquin's hand still clasped in hers, surrounded by women who'd stepped forward to form a protective circle around her. Muteskar spoke in English, his accent heavy but the meaning crystal clear. The woman stays. She is free person. Not property. You leave now or we make you leave. Thomas laughed, ugly and harsh. You think you scare me? She's mine by law. Got the papers to prove it. He reached for his rifle. 20 arrows found their strings in perfect synchronization. The sound of it, that collective drawing of power and intent, froze Thomas mid-motion. His companions' hands moved away from their weapons. Survival instinct finally penetrated their bravado. Your law means nothing here, Muteskar continued. This is Lakota land. Our law says woman chooses her path. She chooses to stay. You will honor this or die here. Decide now. The standoff stretched like pulled sinew. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs but she refused to look away from Thomas. Refused to give him the satisfaction of her fear. She'd run from him once in darkness and desperation. Now she stood her ground in daylight, defended by people who valued her worth as a human being. She saw the exact moment Thomas understood he'd lost. The realization that no amount of violence or intimidation would get her back. That his ownership had been an illusion maintained only by her fear, and that fear had died somewhere between her escape and this moment. Rage twisted his features into something inhuman. You'll regret this, he spat. All of you will regret this. Leave now, Muteskar said quietly. Do not return. If we see you on our land again, we kill you. No warning. No mercy. This I promise. Thomas yanked his horse's head around viciously and spurred away, his friends following quickly. Sarah watched until they disappeared into the trees, watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, watched until Muteskar lowered his hand and the warriors relaxed their bows. Only then did her legs give out. She sat down hard in the dirt, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. Joaquin knelt beside her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders despite the warm day. Other women crowded close, offering touches and words of comfort. Thasunka pushed through to give her a carefully collected bouquet of wildflowers, his young face serious with concern. Muteskar approached last, after ensuring the warriors maintained watch in case of treachery. He sat beside Sarah in the dust, not touching but present. When she finally found her voice, it came out broken and raw. Thank you. For everything. For saving me. For keeping me. For standing against him. The English felt strange on her tongue after weeks of struggling with Lakota. I have nothing to give you in return. I'm nothing. I have nothing. Muteskar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, it was in careful English mixed with Lakota, choosing words she would understand. You are not nothing. You are a brave woman who chose life over death. Who chose freedom over chains. That is everything. He paused, then added softly, you gave us chance to do what is right. To protect someone who needs protection. This is gift to us, not debt you owe. Sarah looked at him through tears she hadn't realized were falling. This man who'd found her broken and never once asked for anything except her healing. Who'd offered safety without conditions. Who'd risked conflict with armed men to honor his word. The old Sarah would have felt obligated to love him for it. The new Sarah recognized something more valuable. Respect. Partnership. The potential for something real built on mutual choice rather than desperation or ownership. I want to stay, she said clearly. Not because I'm afraid to leave. Not because I have nowhere else. I want to stay because this feels like home. Because your people have shown me what it means to be valued. Is that allowed? Muteskar smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. It is not only allowed. It is hoped for. Around them, the camp returned to its rhythms. Children resumed playing. Women went back to their work. Warriors dispersed to their duties. Life continued as it had before the threat, because that's what life did. It moved forward. Sarah stood with Muteskar's help and looked toward the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere beyond them was the world she'd known. The life she'd escaped. But here, surrounded by people who'd chosen to see her worth even when she'd forgotten it herself, was the life she was building. One day at a time. One word at a time. One healed wound at a time. She was finally, truly free. And that freedom tasted sweeter than anything she'd ever known.